Good morning and welcome to the City of Bowie's annual Fair Housing Training for 2022. April is Fair Housing Month, and as part of our ongoing community development block grant programming, we provide this training on an annual basis for members of the public, for code enforcement officials, for realtors, for municipal, county, and federal employees to talk about fair housing, explain what it is, talk about changes that have happened, and discuss how to support residents who have had their fair housing rights violated. We will have this presentation by Manuel Ochoa of the Ochoa Urban Collaborative, apologies. My name is Kay Starr. I am the grant writer for the City of Bowie. And also with us today is Jesse Buggs, who is the director of our office. The agenda today, I will be doing this mini introduction, then I'll turn it over to Mr. Buggs to greet you all. Then we will have the presentation with Manuel. We will pause at points during the presentation to have discussion for folks to ask questions. So feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you or type your question in the chat. Depending on how the discussion progresses, we might have a Q&A at the end, or we might just continue the questions as the presentation proceeds. We want to thank you all for joining us today. So here's a little bit of information about the City of Bowie Grants Office. As I mentioned, Jesse Buggs is the director, and I am the grant writer and program coordinator for various CDBG related programs, including fair housing education. We have fair housing program information at www.cityofbowie.org/fairhousing. And there's also a link on that page to various fair housing resources and information about regulations at the municipal, the county, the state, and the federal level. A little bit about the Office of Grant Development and Administration at the City of Bowie. We're responsible for a wide variety of activities, including making sure that we adhere to all grant policies and procedures, researching grant opportunities, writing grant applications. If we're awarded grant funds, we also manage those funds and manage all reports and audits. We also manage several grant-related and funded programs and do housing and homelessness services, as well as the community development block grant programs offered by the city, including a housing rehabilitation program, a workforce development program, and this program, Fair Housing Education. We are also responsible for the Sustainable Community Action Plan for the City of Bowie. You can find more about our programs again on the website at www.cityofbowie.org/grants. And here's a little bit about the Ochoa Urban Collaborative. Our presenter today, Manuel Ochoa, has over 25 years of experience in urban planning, housing, and community development. He is the principal and founder of the Ochoa Urban Collaborative, and we've worked with him on a variety of housing-related projects, including the completion of the city and county and analysis of impediments to fair housing report, which was adopted in 2020. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse Buggs to give an introduction to everyone.
Thank you, Kay. Good morning to everyone. We want to welcome you to the 2022 Fair Housing Symposium here at the City of Bowie. 2022 presents us with a unique set of social, cultural, and economic dynamics that we can use to compare and contrast our present day circumstances with those of the 54 years ago when the Fair Housing Act of 1968 became the law of the land. Thank you, Kay Starr, for my staff here, for all of your skillful talents in organizing this event today, and for bringing my colleague Manuel Ochoa back to conduct this symposium. We know he's an exceptional presenter and leader in this area. I could not think of a more qualified and eloquent speaker for today's session in today's environment than Manuel. So we thank you all for attending today's Fair Housing Symposium. And I hope that you will not just listen, but learn and use what you learn to help eliminate discrimination in housing for us all. Manuel, the show is yours, and I thank you again for your presentation today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jesse, for the very kind introduction. I really appreciate that, and I'm very pleased to be with all of you here again, and also see some familiar faces in the audience. So let's get started, and we will start with our introductions for today too, and see who's on here. But before we get started on the introductions, I did just want to ask the question, does fair housing matter today? When we have the perceptions of what are the perceptions of fair housing, and what it actually means, it is certainly about housing discrimination and the direct discrimination that we think about, but it's also more than that too, right? It also affects other related areas too that we may not necessarily perceive as directly related to fair housing, depending on how involved we are in these areas. So whether it's the discussion on home values, that has been a huge topic of conversation, including over at HUD, including whether it's the maintenance of the status quo through the Thrive 2050 in Montgomery County, or the construction of affordable housing, even in a jurisdiction where they have prioritized it over many years. All these things that we can see affect what is the opportunity for housing for all, certainly all groups and all incomes and classes. And so that's why it truly is still important today, and which is why this conversation is still relevant. So I would love for all of you to take a moment here and just write in the chat and just what comes to mind when you think about fair housing. And don't think about it too much. Just go ahead and just put in just one word when you think about fair housing. And let's just go ahead and do that. You see we have around 26 participants today. And just a quick way to get things going. And put in some words. Great. Thank you. Lack of housing supply, stability, safe and accommodating. Others, those are great terms, great words. Regulating. Thank you. Protections. Safe and adequate, accessible to everyone. Excellent. Those are some great examples. So keep them, definitely keep those going if some others come to mind. And also just take a moment here too to answer these two questions too about just the fair housing, about how familiar you are with fair housing and its terms. This is not a test by any means, but just a way for me to see about how much detail and where to go deeper and where to provide more explanation. I know some of you may have participated in this presentation last year, but if you haven't, if this is totally new to you, then welcome. That's great as well. And then we have a second poll question, which we would love to see where you're coming to us from, whether you are a member of the public or you work for a federal agency, as we find lots of federal agency representatives in the area, or you work for one of the local municipalities in Prince George's County for the city of Bowie, or one of the other neighboring jurisdictions, since the invite went to the region as well, or whether you work as a realtor or in code enforcement, property manager, welcome. So we have quite a bit of good representation that I see here today. So this is excellent. It's a great cross section.
We also had a few more comments come in about fair housing, fairness in pricing, and equal opportunity to reside in the home or community of choice. Excellent.
So we have, okay, so I still see that the poll is still moving. We still have a few more people answering the questions. Excellent.
All right, last call for answering the poll. There are a few people who haven't had a chance to answer yet. I'm going to close it down in about 10 seconds. All right, I am going to close the poll down. Thanks very much for everyone who answered. I'm going to share the results so you guys can see. Most people have some or quite a bit of knowledge about fair housing. And we also have a wide variety of people: municipal employees, county employees, realtors, code enforcement, members of the public, and federal employees. Great. Thank you everyone for answering our poll.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll have something for everyone today. So some of the information for those of you who are expert who work in this area, some of this you've heard it before, but so hopefully some of the other discussion questions, you'll be able to participate and give some thought or perhaps some detail. So I see some representatives as well from the different jurisdictions who I've been working with. So just by way of background as well, and thank you again, Jesse and Kay, for that kind introduction. My background is in housing and community development, as well as urban planning, and I've worked in the region and around the country, as I said, for over 20 years. But most recently, one of the big projects that I've had the privilege of working on is on the regional analysis of impediments to fair housing choice through the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which we will get to talk about today. And I see that some of our participants are also involved with that as well. So, so we hope to see you add some information, some commentary, and some thoughts to the discussion as well. So that would be great. But first, I'm going to start out with the story. And if you've seen this picture here, and I will give you a clue. I won't tell you right away where it is, but I'm just going to ask if you've ever heard of Reno City. I called it Fort, well, there's Fort Reno, but I should have put Reno City. Have any of you ever heard of Reno City? And I first came across this building because some dear family friends, longtime Washingtonians, live in this neighborhood. And so from the Metro, I've walked along this building, this empty building that I've seen on the corner, and it is a standalone building with a park around it. There's nothing else. And there's no signage. There's no explanation about what this is, what the history is behind it, why there is this corner storefront that's sitting here. And so over the years, I've come to learn about what this place is. And what it is actually a storefront and the last remaining building of what was once a thriving neighborhood in Northwest DC. And Fort Reno and the Fort Reno area, Fort Reno Park in Tenleytown. And it was once known as Reno City. So I kind of, collapse the words together, but it is Fort Reno Park in Tenleytown, and the neighborhood that was once there was Reno City. And you can see in the lines here, if you look to see, these were actually the streets that crossed in Reno City, and there's still some neighborhoods, there's some homes along Ellicott and other places here that are a reminder of what was once a thriving neighborhood. And so what is the backstory to this place? Well, Fort Reno, as the name implies, was actually part of the Civil War defenses that ringed Washington, DC. And as you can see in the circle of the X on the map, it is in the Tenleytown neighborhood, one of the highest points in the city. And it is one of the natural highest elevations. And if you've been by there, and you've probably seen one of the radio towers, but it played a key role in the Civil War, and was actually one of the main protections. Washington came very close to being occupied or attacked by Confederate soldiers. So it was these defenses that kept the Confederate troops at bay during the Civil War. But in the post-war period, and something that I've come to learn too as well, that part of the Emancipation Proclamation, in that Lincoln's proclamation, enslaved persons who came to a federal facility, military post, were given protection, and they automatically got their freedom once they arrived at a federal facility or a military outpost. And what happened in this case around Fort Reno and in other places around the South and around the country is that African American communities started to develop around the fortifications, and that's exactly what happened here. And just to give you some highlights, if you've been by there, some of those homes, you see the pictures on the right. There was a segregated school called Jesse Reno, and some of the streets that still exist today, Davenport and Ellicott City. You can see some of those homes. And you can see here the streets that crisscrossed the entire area. And there were churches, several churches, as well as a civic group, the Moses Lodge, which was founded in 1885. Now, Reno City was the victim of urban renewal. And one of the things that I found fascinating about learning more about the urban renewal, when we think about urban renewal, we think about what happened in the 50s, and that's certainly part of the case here. But one of the things that I learned was that actually it was part of a plan through the National Capital Planning Commission, which, in the early 1900s was the sole planning commission before home rule in the district. And part of their plan was they had this idea of a parkway that was going to link all of the former civil rights fortifications around the city in a ring, almost like a tree-lined beltway, so to speak, was the early version of the beltway in the city. It was called Fort Drive, and you can see pieces of it left all over the city of Washington, places like Della Carlia Parkway, and you can see stumps in other places around Northwest DC. And so at the time, they looked at already as this neighborhood as being targeted for redevelopment. And through that process, they started buying more and more pieces of property. There was certainly a fight against that. So the neighbors didn't necessarily take that lying down. They, in the 20s, they went all the way to the House of Representatives. They had a hearing because, of course, the district was ruled by Congress with commissioners that were appointed. And, Black leaders continued to petition the district Supreme Court on Fort Reno's behalf. But to make a long story short, they lost. And as you can see here, that they took over the land for high school, Wilson, that you see today, Alice Steele Junior High, and then also the reservoir that was built on the property, as well as some other facilities, which are also interesting as well. They're somewhat mysterious. And some of you may have heard too, when I heard this about when I first moved to Washington, that there were, certainly hear about, secret facilities and things like that. And, what was happening in Fort Reno Park. And indeed, there was the tower that you see at Fort Reno Park was actually part of a continuity of government network that linked the president and the emergency government communication in case of a nuclear attack, and connected it to other key facilities like Camp David, and I'm sure places like the Greenbrier. And so, as you can see, the neighborhood was completely decimated. The last resident was forced out in 1951, and most of the homes were razed. So I'm just showing that, Fort Reno Park today, just wanted to show that picture again, because some of you may have visited the park and have perhaps enjoyed the sunset or the views from that park, or maybe have gone to a ball game there, or maybe someone who went to Wilson. It is certainly a place that, especially if you live in DC, that you've been to. But if you haven't, I think it's also just representative of other neighborhoods and places around the Washington region and around the country, perhaps some unknown history that has been, either covered up or something that people don't want to talk about anymore. But I do think that it's important to talk about it. And we have to talk about it, particularly, I think, in the context of, not in my backyard, and, the NIMBYism that takes place, and, the quote unquote, who belongs where, and the what neighborhood character, and all those terms that are thrown around. And what I always like to look at and think about is what is the impact that that redevelopment has had. So if we think about Tenleytown today and what happened over time with the, with the construction of the metro and redevelopment and reinvestment in the neighborhood, imagine those African-American families that have lived there for many generations, what they have lost out on as far as equity in their home. Think about that, probably at the time in the 1950s, their home might have been worth less than $10,000, which was probably the median. And, how much is a home in Northwest DC worth today, right? It's like $500,000, perhaps, but likely more, of course. And so, but overall, we see the impact. And I'd always like to show these numbers. I was checking to see if these numbers have been updated, but these are still primarily the working numbers. But the story is still the same, whether it's 2019 or today, that the median wealth of Black households in the United States was $24,100 compared with $189,100 for white households. And the typical Black household had about 12.7% of the wealth of the typical white household, and they owned $165,000 less in wealth. So this means that on average, Black households had about 14.5% of the wealth of white households. And if you look at this graph here, you can see the large gap, and it hasn't really changed much over time. I mean, certainly, as you can see in the recession, it's actually was widened where white households were actually doing slightly better, probably the higher income households. And then you can see too here that, that whether it's McKinsey that has looked at this issue of the racial wealth gap, and certainly the Federal Reserve has continued to look at this, it's hard to explain away why this racial gap exists without looking at that history. So I wanted to share with you that history of Tenleytown and Fort Reno and Reno City as a microcosm about that racial wealth gap that exists. And this story has been replicated hundreds, if not thousands of times across the country. And I think another way to think about it too is what McKinsey has come up with. They did a major study on the racial wealth gap, and they calculated that if we could close the racial wealth gap, the actual U.S. gross domestic product could be 4 to 6% higher by 2028. So depending on the assumptions, that translates anywhere between 2,900 to 4,300 in GDP per capita. And that's just astounding. Imagine what that could mean for our society. So I just wanted to kind of put that in the bigger picture and the context before delving in. And so I wanted to just stop right there and just see if there was any commentary from the folks or anything in the chat, or maybe some additional thoughts. Maybe you have visited this area, or maybe you live nearby or driven by, and just wanted to see some thoughts. And I'm taking a look here. That's right. Daryl was able to identify that, and so was Alicia as well. So, and just kind of wanted to stop for a moment and see if there were any similar stories in the area where you live, any neighborhoods or things that you've learned about that you'd like to share before I dive into just what is fair housing.
And if you want to raise your hands and speak rather than type in the chat, just raise your hand and I can unmute you. Or again, typing in the chat is also an option.
Just want to get you all involved so I don't talk straight for 2 hours. If not, I'm going to pick on you too, because I know some of you on here as well. So say who you are. Okay, well, we'll just keep going. But certainly we can find examples, and I'll just mention that in my own neighborhood, the West Bard neighborhood, which is on River Road in Montgomery County, not far away from Tenleytown, has been another area that's been under a major redevelopment, but was formerly a historic African-American neighborhood. And the developers refused to recognize a historic African-American cemetery in the redevelopment plans. And that also includes county agencies in the discussion. It's gotten very complicated. but there was the history of basically they paved over a historic African-American cemetery in this part of Montgomery County. So we find this much more frequently than perhaps we imagine, but you don't have to look very far, I have to say. So let us continue here. So what is the Fair Housing Act? Well, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 is the last chapter in landmark civil rights legislation that started with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It immediately nullified thousands of racially restrictive covenants across the country. Many of these covenants, which we'll talk about in the history, still exist today on paper. They have no legal force of law, but they in fact still exist. And the architects of the Fair Housing Act included Dr. Martin Luther King, who was assassinated only 10 days before the passage of the Fair Housing Act. It was the most hard fought of the civil rights legislations. And in fact, Dr. Martin Luther King was marching for jobs and housing in places like Chicago and places around the country, and very much spoke about integration and this thorny issue about where we live and how we live, and the discrimination that takes place was one of the most difficult conversations in the civil rights era, for sure. But one of the things that I think provides, even though it took the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, on the flip side, there was bipartisanship, and you see two people here, right in the center is Senator Edward Brooke, and he's looking at you from Massachusetts, and then looking over President Johnson's shoulder is a younger Senator Mondale, and later Vice President Mondale, who called those were the two key sponsors of the Fair Housing Act. And his family, when Vice President Mondale passed away, his family shared that one of his greatest achievements was the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act, as the part that we're most familiar with, enshrines into law and ensures that persons are not discriminated against in the purchase or rental of housing due to their disability, their race, their sex, color, national origin, religion, or a family status. And what the Fair Housing Act does address both on the rental side, place things such as the refusal to rent or sell, as I mentioned, negotiating for housing, making a dwelling unavailable, setting different conditions, falsely deny that housing is available for inspection, deny access to or membership in a facility or service, such as, for example, maybe like a pool or some kind of other community facility. And in the purchase side, also the Fair Housing Act protects against the refusal to make a mortgage loan to someone due to one of those protected classes that I identified, or imposing different conditions such as higher interest rates or additional points or fees or discrimination in appraisals, which we have been talking about very much lately in particular. And then also threaten, coerce, intimidate, or interfere with anyone with their rights to housing. Some of us may think that some of that has gone away, but that still exists, unfortunately, particularly with undocumented families and persons. And in the pandemic, we've heard of all sorts of terrible discriminatory practices, even in light of the mandatory protections from the CDC and the moratorium on evictions.
We have a comment in the chat on this topic from Linda Taylor. In terms of preserving affordable housing, it would be great if the county would try to not only update or rehab houses, but also commercial establishments in affordable communities like Palmer Park.
That is a great point, and actually something that is near and dear to my heart. I'm working with communities along the Purple Line to protect immigrant-owned and minority-owned businesses along several key corridors. So yes, so we definitely, even though we are talking about the Fair Housing Act, and the Fair Housing Act is about protecting housing, we should really think about this in terms of community and not just the housing itself, right? So community is both the businesses and the services, the public facilities, all of that together. So that's a very good point, and that's actually part of what we're looking for when we talk about communities of opportunity. There are some exceptions in the federal law related to fair housing. So it does not, for example, owner-occupied units with less than 4 units, single-family housing sold or rented without a broker, senior housing, and housing operated by private clubs or member organizations. There are some exceptions, but there are also other exceptions related to that, even if it is a single-family home without a broker. But those are more detailed questions. These are the overall exceptions. It's also important to note that that there are additional local and state protected classes in addition to race, national origin, color, marital status, sex, gender identity, age, religion, sexual orientation, or familial status, and most recently, source of income as well. Discrimination is also protected. Persons with disabilities as well. So the refusal to deny reasonable modifications to a housing unit, that is protected. There are additional laws. The refusal to make what are known as reasonable accommodations. So for example, if a person with a disability asks for a unit that might have a bathroom that has wider doors or a shower in exchange for what is being offered to them, or being able to put in grab bars or things like that, that is protected also in law. And then we also want to encourage the universal design in the construction of housing as well. So obviously that is hard to mandate for private housing, but there are ways that we can encourage that. But certainly for publicly subsidized housing, I think there's much more that we could do as far as incorporating universal design. So from the get-go, more units are available, and that is certainly an issue here in our region. There are additional protections as well. So early in the administration, Secretary Fudge announced that HUD was withdrawing the proposed rule to weaken the equal access rule. So there were, very bluntly, during the previous administration, a lot of regulations or laws were weakened in the previous administration. So one of the first priorities of the new administration was to affirm, for example, that gender identity is protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act, where sex is a protected class. So that is also one of the advancements during this administration as well. I would say also that we've been very busy too in this region as well. Whether it's in Maryland or in Virginia, they both added source of income protections as well. The Maryland General Assembly passed the Home Opportunities Made Equal Act, which prevents the source of income discrimination, as I said. And then in the county, the Prince George's County established a policy of ensuring equal opportunity and in all housing accommodation. I will say that we still have a lot of work to do in source of income protection. So even though it's in law, I know jurisdictions are trying to do more to get the word out. I think we still need to do more as far as educating and training landlords and property owners so that they understand what these protections are. So whether it's a multi-family unit or a smaller number of units or accessory dwelling units as well, that there are protections to ensure that whether you have a voucher or whether you've received emergency rental assistance, that because you are receiving those forms of assistance, that is just as valuable as cash or a check or some other form of payment. And I would recommend here also to you, the Equal Rights Center has a good toolkit on source of income discrimination. So if that's something that is new to you, we can go ahead and send that link to you. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to see if I can click the link here, see if that works. And it does. So I will go ahead and copy this and drop it in the chat for you. Let me see this here. So this is an excellent guide that you can use if you want to go deeper. The Equal Rights Center is based in Washington, DC, but they serve the region, and they are a good source of information for, for not just on source of income, but just fair housing in general, and other forms of discrimination. So, but just some key questions just to kind of think about is if you know somebody or you're working with somebody, whether they were denied the opportunity to rent after they mentioned that they had a voucher, were they restricted in the certain kinds of units, even though it was available in the price range that you were looking for after you were disclosing what you would pay for in rent, or you were told that you did not qualify for the advertised incentives such as reduced fees or waivers, or that you wouldn't have access to certain amenities. So all of these are forms of source of income, and that is protected now under the law. So it is important to encourage, and I would just say for whether it's source of income or any form of discrimination, that documentation is the key, most definitely. And then just a word on just following up on that. So whether it's source of income or other forms of discrimination, residents of Bowie and Prince George's County may file a complaint of discrimination with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights at MCCR, and I can also include that link. You can also click on the link that Kay dropped as well at the beginning. That has a whole host of resources, not just for City of Bowie residents, but for county residents as well. And you'll find many of the links there. So if you are a resident in the state of Maryland, I would encourage you to go to the MCCR first. Call them if you have any kinds of questions. But I also would encourage you to visit any of the regional or statewide fair housing organizations. So whether it's the Equal Rights Center that I mentioned, or the Fair Housing Action Center of Maryland. If you're not sure whether you have a discrimination case, you should always ask. You should always talk it through to someone, talk it through with an expert, especially early on. The earlier that you ask your questions, you can figure out what are the best ways to document what is happening and then be able to report it. And finally, most importantly, you are also able to directly complain or file your complaint directly to the HUD Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. You can call the phone number directly. There is a relay that you can use for persons with disabilities, or you can go directly to the HUD website, which is listed here, and fill out an online complaint. I'm just going to be very honest with you before I open it up to questions, that it is a rather a laborious process to submit a complaint directly to HUD. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it either, that it can take months and sometimes years to make an investigation. So I still think it's important to do, but I also, again, just recommend that you start out with the fair housing organizations where they are able to perhaps answer more questions. And Kay, you were going to raise something from the chat. You were going to mention something you've seen on chat.
Yes, we posted a bunch of these links in the chat, and we also have a comment from Noah Wright that people can also reach out to Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. We recently started covering housing discrimination in our bases. And then another comment from L. Clay: financial obstacles are a frequent impediment to a person's ability to qualify for housing. Is there a realistic way to take a deeper look into the practices of the credit rating industry to see if the formulas they use to assess a person's credit worthiness are not discriminatory?
That is a huge issue that we definitely need to do more work on, for sure. Organizations like the the Fair Housing Alliance is one that has done work in this area, but other national organizations like the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights are certainly looking at these forms of discrimination. We certainly need to do more in that area, such as, for example, in property, whether it's property assessments, but also the appraisals, most particularly. And HUD actually launched a initiative to come up, and Secretary Fudge appointed a czar to look particularly at this area more deeply, and came up with a bunch of recommendations. But I would just, if you wouldn't mind, and I think you mentioned too that I think, who was it? Mr. Wright, was it as well? If you wouldn't mind, I think that is, I know that's something that was in discussion for many, many years. So if the Office of Human Rights is covering housing issues, does that mean that that now that they have received they've received the certification from HUD to be able to conduct housing, investigate housing complaints on behalf of HUD, or is this an internal first step too with the county before seeking that? And if you could, believe it was Mr. Wright. Is that right, Kay? I think that would be important to know, because
Yes.
that would be such a huge county. Or you're welcome to drop it in on chat if you are unable to come off of mute too. So, but we welcome that development. That's certainly something that when we worked on the analysis of impediments for the county, that was one of our top recommendations. So I'm really glad to hear that.
And I'm saving all these links. I will be compiling them in a document that I can send to everyone who attended today. So you will have them also in handout format.
Excellent. Thank you, Kay. So when certainly what we're most familiar with are the protections against discrimination in the purchase or rental of housing, but the Fair Housing Act of 1968 wanted to go one step further, and ensuring that the practices, that the reasons for fair housing was protected under law. And so the act enjoined federal agencies, and in turn, HUD enjoined or asked communities that receive federal funds to affirmatively further fair housing. So if you think about this, so this is a federal obligation that was created. And so when a community receives a community development block grant or other funds, they are doing this on behalf of the federal government. And so you sign up for all these other requirements, and that's why fair housing is a part of it. And affirmatively furthering fair housing is that the term that you've heard, and it applies to all HUD grant funds, whether it's community development block grant funds that funds things like facade improvements or housing rehabilitation, or public services, or home investment partnerships that subsidizes the construction of affordable housing, or the emergency solutions grant that funds homeless programs. All of that, that's why the Fair Housing Act is applicable to that. And the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 also includes affirmatively furthering fair housing when they created the Community Development Block Grant Program. So all jurisdictions are required to complete what is formally known as the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. I like to call it a fair housing plan because it is less wonky for sure.
Oh, we also had a comment. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Kay.
We had two comments from Fatima. We have not received certification from HUD yet, but working towards it. And Noah Wright, we've been given authority through the County Council via bill number CB-097-2021. We are starting a relationship with HUD. Our authority comes from the county.
That's fantastic. So that's great news. I'm really glad to hear it, because I know that they've been doing good work in other areas. So I'm glad that that they're able to follow up on housing complaints, because that's still an issue today. And of course that news article that came out, and particularly in this area, Prince George's County has been one of the places where they uncovered some of these disparate practices in appraisals. So, and that was highlighted in the Washington Post. And but why did Congress pass the Federal Housing Act? Well, we know there is this long history of racial discrimination that has affected, land patterns to this day. It started, even with practices such as sharecropping and tenant abuse and land swindles right after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. But the federal government also sponsored segregation in the Housing Act of 1937, which created public housing. In order to pass it, the compromise was to create segregated housing when public housing was built. There were restrictive covenants that became very pernicious in the 19 teens and 20s. And if you live in a home that was built particularly in the teens, 20s, even into the 30s and 40s, you were likely to find a restrictive covenant that prevented a home from being sold to persons of color, and sometimes, because of religion as well. Certainly persons of the Jewish faith were also discriminated against and are mentioned in restrictive covenants. Now, those restrictive covenants no longer have force of law today, but they can still be found in the deeds. If you go back there, you can look at the history of the deed, you are likely to find it. And not to mention that during the Civil Rights era, as there were interest in integrating, it often included some forms of violence in neighborhoods. And so during the time period of the 60s, when the many of the suburbs were being built, and so-called white flight, there was a lot of blockbusting that took place, and that was also another terrible practice where basically homeowners were scared into selling with the quote unquote fear that persons of color were moving into the neighborhood. So we start out, all the way back with, as I mentioned, with the idea, which is, almost become a myth, but it does have a source in history about the idea that enslaved persons would not only just have their freedom, but how would they be given the economic means to succeed? And so that's where this idea was born of 40 acres and a mule, which was promised and then withdrawn. But even today, we'll still read about this today about Black farmers across America, which is why this administration has made that a priority, because there have been many lawsuits where African-American farmers have lost their land. I mentioned the restrictive covenants that took place in places all over the country, and these are just two examples of restrictive covenants. And then there's also forms of government sponsored segregation as well, with the Federal Housing Act too, that provided mortgages to not only to buy a home, but also for developers. And seen here is, you'll see a picture of Levittown, which was part of, or still is, that neighborhood is still a part of the city of Bowie. And when Levittown was built, it was built with restrictive covenants. And so we forget that Levittowns were built across the country and became popular places in they're part of the imagination of suburbanization in America, but they were built with restrictive covenants. So yes, these were great homes for working class families, but only for working class white families. And as you can see here, two examples of redlining. I mentioned the federal, the FHA loans, Federal Housing Administration, which is part of HUD. And you can see two examples of maps. On the left is one of the District of Columbia, and it includes, you can see some of the red tones in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and Arlington County. And so you can see here, and on the right is Chicago, and so-called redlining maps. And it's not just a misnomer; it is literal, not just a figurative term. that there were neighborhoods that that were marked as less than ideal for investment from not just the FHA, but in turn, private banks would not loan in this area because the FHA had marked them as undesirable for investment. I also mentioned earlier the history of urban renewal and the example of Reno City that started in the early 1900s, but certainly the urban renewal that was funded by the federal government in the 1950s. And here you see the Southwest waterfront area, which is where HUD is located today on the left. And here's another example on the right as well. And the analysis, and so part of it in order to address that is that HUD created a process that has had gone through various different iterations that is known today as the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. That is a planning process that reviews patterns of residential segregation and incidents of housing discrimination. It evaluates the impacts of ongoing segregation, such as in lending, and then makes recommendations on how counties and cities can improve housing choices for current and future residents. And just as a reminder, as Kay and Jesse mentioned, the city of Bowie completed their analysis of impediments in October of 2020, and it was soon after passed by the city of Bowie in November of 2020. And here are two of the goals that are highlighted as part of the city's AI, about increasing awareness of fair housing rights and responsibilities, continuing their fair housing education program. This symposium is part of that effort. And then also greater efforts that the city has made in implementing a moderately priced dwelling unit program or inclusionary housing program. So that's something that is a goal, and certainly the city of Bowie has made making great strides as they develop housing to include different forms of MPDUs and affordability included in the development, particularly with the additional bonuses that might be provided to for development. So as part of this entire process, ultimately, HUD has to certify that the analysis of impediments at the plan for the county and the city meets all of these requirements, that the plan is certified that it analyzes housing discrimination, promotes fair housing choice for all, and housing accessibility, and enforce the Fair Housing Act and related laws. Now it gets a little tricky because we've been through various policy changes over the years. So I have the ping pong here, but it could also be a form of whiplash. And so, basically the backstory, which is why it might be a little bit confusing, the AI remained primarily unenforced up until the 1990s, with few standards for the format about how it was done. So the obligation was there, but HUD didn't really give you a lot of information on how to do it. Programs like the home program in the 90s started to provide some more format, and the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity started to provide some guidance on how to go about doing that. And so there was a format to complete an AI, which was at least the, what should be included in a analysis of impediments. But what happened is that there were various levels of enforceability, and it was pretty unclear about how HUD was going to enforce that, and when, and how to do it. And a lot of local jurisdictions felt like it was a costly effort to undertake, and they didn't have enough support. Were there ways that HUD could provide some information, whether it's maps or graphs or data that could be provided? And so, they took steps to look at that, particularly after the Government Accountability Office wrote a report stating that HUD was not enforcing the Fair Housing Act and that the AI was not effective. So that would turn to 5 years later with the 2015 publication of the Assessment of Fair Housing Rule that provided all this guidance that I mentioned and new regulations, and that was a format that existed was created during the Obama administration. Then during the Trump administration, they passed rules so that all of that went away, basically. In the current administration, they issued a memorandum in January, as practically, when they entered office, instructing the department to examine the effect of the previous administration's final rule and repeal of the 2015 rule. They reinstated a process to provide technical assistance and other funding support, basically providing a pathway so that communities could submit their existing AIs. And that was in June of 2021. But local governments are still waiting for more fleshed out and detailed information on the rule, on whether they're going to leave the rule as is and bring back the 2015 rule. There's likely to be some improvements to that based on the comments that HUD has received from local jurisdictions and organizations across the country, but we're still waiting for that, and there hasn't been any updates for that. There also have been executive orders from the President Biden related to racial equity, criminal justice, and discrimination against Native Americans and Asian and Asian Pacific and Pacific Islander persons, as well as a memorandum on redressing our nation's and federal government's history of discriminatory practices. So basically having federal agencies take a look internally about how some of their regulations and practices have perpetrated forms of discrimination. And then the other executive order that the president signed that requires federal agencies to conduct equity assessments to identify barriers in existing regulations and policies and how to address them. The other thing that I think it definitely has been a major factor on related to housing discrimination has been the repeal of the eviction moratorium. Certainly that helped protect a lot of people during the pandemic. The administration extended it several times, but unfortunately in August, the US Supreme Court ruled on ending the temporary stay for the federal eviction moratorium. So as you might recall, there was a lot of back and forth between lower courts and upper courts that went to the Supreme Court. And basically the Supreme Court was silent on and didn't exactly make a ruling per se, but just what they did, they basically overturned the eviction moratorium unfortunately with not a lot of explanation, but just basically basing on the lower court ruling that the CDC exceeded its authority. So I'm just going to stop right there for a moment and see if you all have any questions or just any commentary on any of the history of the Fair Housing Act or the Fair Housing Act itself, or some examples that you may have in your local area. Do we have anything in the chat?
No further comments in the chat so far. Also, if you don't want to type, please raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Yeah. Would welcome your participation. Great, all right. I'll go ahead and continue. So next, what I wanted to share with you are is the regional fair housing plan and some of our preliminary recommendations to date. So this has been an ongoing process that started in the spring of last year and probably will continue into the fall. It includes a number of jurisdictions in the region, and the project team includes the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, which has lots of experience conducting fair housing plans and analysis of impediments. on a regional basis, whether it's in Los Angeles or Orange County or in Kansas City, they have lots of experience. And we're also working with the Urban Institute, which it provides lots of great data and analysis on urban policy and policy issues, and particularly in the housing area as well. And we've teamed up with them, and my outfit has been leading the community engagement. And so we've been doing presentations similar to this, somewhat in less detail for the general public, and trying to get their feedback on what they see as their barriers in their area, as well as asking them for their recommendations. So as I mentioned, the Fair Housing Act went one step further in dismantling the causes of segregation, which is why we have the analysis of impediments and the requirement to affirmatively further fair housing. And we're looking at it in a regional way because, especially in a metropolitan area like Washington, whether it's Washington or New York or Baltimore, we know that these problems and these issues do not stop at jurisdictional lines or borders. So for example, we know that people may live in Prince George's County and commute into the district, or may commute to the city of Alexandria or Fairfax, or vice versa. People who live in the district might work in Prince George's County. So we know that those lengthy commutes have an impact on housing choice, on what people can afford. So a lot of times, certainly, yes, a lot of people are working from home during the pandemic, but the commutes are coming back, and we've seen traffic patterns come back again to, in some cases, to pre-pandemic levels during certain times of the day. We also know that there are areas of concentrated poverty with underperforming schools. And we also know that the communities of color have, more than, they've suffered the negative effects of proximity to brownfields and areas of air contamination. And, they seem to have a preponderance of noxious uses next to neighborhoods, persons of color. So, and certainly the issues related to persons, accessible units for persons with disabilities, this is a perennial issue that can be found. There are not enough units across the area. And then we certainly are, many jurisdictions are focused on trying to create more neighborhoods of opportunity with good schools so that there's more opportunity. And you've heard COG talk about that, as far as you might have heard the term complete communities, and that has been part of the regional planning effort that jurisdictions are trying to integrate into their own planning efforts. But this effort, which is taking place under the auspices of COG, and this is something that regional housing leaders or housing leaders from the jurisdictions have been talking about for many years, I think at least 5 years. And this effort includes the District of Columbia, Montgomery County, and the city of Gaithersburg in Maryland, and then Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, and the city of Alexandria in Virginia. It does not include outlying areas like Frederick County or Charles County, nor does it include Prince George's County, because since they completed their AI due to their timeline in 2020, they did not join this effort, but they might participate in other ways. And I know certainly Mr. Buggs has been an active member for many years on these issues. So I know certainly that the city of Bowie continues to be active in the discussions, and possibly active in the discussions as well on some of these regional goals and actions. But just some examples of what this looks like in other places. The city of Richmond conducted their own regional AI several years ago. Baltimore has also completed one. I just wanted to share one example with you, and these are just 3 recommendations on the regional recommendations. They talked about funding for eviction mediation and eviction prevention programs. We can see how important this is today in light of the end of the eviction moratorium and trying to prevent homelessness due to the evictions that they're speeding their way through the courts. We're also looking at a pilot. They're also looking at a pilot program to incentivize landlords to house tenants perceived as high risk. Other communities basically have come up with a form of insurance guaranteeing that that if a tenant doesn't pay their rent or doesn't have enough funding for their application fee, they can cover that. So there are other good examples around the country. And then the final example here is a pilot rental rehabilitation program for landlords in smaller units who agree to keep units affordable to area median income of 60%. So just to share with you too, so these are just our preliminary regional recommendations. So there are going to be recommendations for each jurisdiction, but there are also going to be regional recommendations, which I think will be the stickier widgets to discuss as, among the region. So certainly the individual goals and actions are likely to be highly discussed within each jurisdiction and take some time, but these as well, because then all the jurisdictions are going to have to come together. But what the team did is to try to look at some of the big themes. So you can see here that that one of the main themes that we've discussed is this issue about housing supply. So especially to low and moderate income families in the region. So we know that there are lots of great practices, good practices around the region, but how can we synchronize that so that some of the good practices that are done in Fairfax are also done in Prince George's County and vice versa. So each jurisdiction, I think, has made advancements in different areas, but we kind of need the whole. So whether it's housing bonds or real estate transfer taxes or mandatory inclusionary housing, all of those, we need the different tools in the toolbox in order for it to work. And so I think, if one jurisdiction is requiring on-site mandatory inclusionary housing while another jurisdiction is still allowing for a fee, I don't think, for a developer to pay into a fee, we're not going to advance. And we certainly know that that we still require the construction of thousands of units just to catch up due to the crisis that we have in the supply in the region. The other thing that we have also talked about, which I think will be something that will be debated, is given the limited, not just the limited supply, but the limited resources, right? And even though places like the district are putting more funding and other jurisdictions as well, it's likely going to take a while to get there. So rather than creating programs that target people at the higher end of the income spectrum, how about in starting out with making sure that those with chronic housing shortages for the low income individuals and families at the lower end, that we target programs starting with the families that have a harder time, because that's where we lack units. So people at the higher end of the spectrum, yes, there is a shortage, but there's less of a shortage and there's more choice, versus people at the lowest end have the smallest choices available to them. We also want to look at ideas like low interest loans to single family homeowners and grants to develop accessory dwelling units. So certainly multi-generational dwellings is something that has become much more popular and much more of a need, and accessory dwelling units can be a tool for that. So another big issue is this issue around zoning reform and land use policies that foster a development of fair and affordable housing. So how about allowing accessory dwelling units by right? That's advanced in some jurisdictions, but not all. Increasing those zoning incentives to create affordable housing on site, as I mentioned. Affordable housing overlays, that could be another option as well. And then this idea of a fair housing equity analysis. So we heard that mention that the Biden administration is encouraging an equity analysis of their policies and programs. But how about doing the same thing for large developments? Would it be possible to do an equity analysis so that when there's zoning changes taking place, you take into account the development and what the impact is on affordability and the effect on fair housing and increasing housing choice? So that's another option. Another one is also preservation of housing preservation, not to be confused with historic preservation, but housing preservation. We know that there are lots of old school project-based HUD Section 8 back in the day when landlords were given a subsidy to build affordable units. Many of those units are expiring and they're in great locations. So how about we spend some funding to keep those units affordable today? Because once those units are gone, it's going to be much more difficult. We talked about the NIMBYism, not in my backyard. So housing preservation is a key tool. And then I would also mention as well that one of the things that we talked about too are the importance of mobile home parks. And yes, I think we realize that those are not necessarily the ideal home that that we might want for someone. We would probably want someone more permanent. There are abusive practices related to mobile home parks because the mobile home owner doesn't own they own the mobile home, but they don't own the land underneath. So how about creating a right of first refusal so that those residents can purchase their land and their homes? Because the reality is, and even though there aren't a lot of mobile home parks in this area, they are a form of affordable housing. And once they're gone, they're gone. So what can we do to improve the mobile home parks themselves and not only just allow them to buy, but also improve their the facilities themselves? We also want to do more to protect the housing rights of individuals with protected classes that I mentioned. And I won't mention all of them here. I think expanding and improving the use of housing vouchers, the transferability is something that Baltimore has focused in on that I think we could do a better job here. And then I will point out to you the Right to Counsel program. We know that legal aid organizations are very effective in helping tenants in protecting tenants, and in eviction cases, a lot of cases are moving quickly through the courts, and having some kind of legal representation gives them a chance, at least a fighting chance, to be able to keep their home and keep their unit. So expanding the right to counsel and having that funded, I think, would be a key recommendation besides the fair housing outreach and education that we've talked about. The other, we talked about also reducing discriminatory barriers for persons with disabilities. We need to do basically one recommendation is we need to do more testing. And, and we know jurisdictions are doing testing, but what kind of testing are they doing and for what protected classes? And so this is one area where we've seen that there hasn't been enough testing. I would also point out that the LGBTQ plus community also mentioned that there isn't enough testing and there is discrimination taking place. So testing is a powerful tool in helping find if discrimination is taking place. We can't go with just anecdotes. We actually need hard evidence, and testing is a tried and true way of doing that. And that is an important contribution that fair housing organizations provide, is that testing. Agencies can do that too, but I think nonprofit fair housing organizations are also very well poised in doing fair housing testing. Another area that we've talked a lot about, which we don't think about necessarily as related to housing, but it is when we talked about increasing opportunity, is transportation. And so free bus transportation is something that has been talked about a lot post-pandemic. That was been provided in many jurisdictions, but We need to find ways to continue that, not just in one jurisdiction, but throughout the region. And then another movement is looking at changing and expanding bus routes. So, so that we change bus routes, that it's not just about the suburban routes that bring people into the center or into the downtown of each local county, but also making sure that these bus routes help expand access to job centers wherever they may be. And some of these job centers are in more suburban areas, so it could be, within a jurisdiction too. Another area too, which I think we'll spend, wanted to see if we could have a discussion on this. I think that there is a lot to watch on the land use and zoning front. There has been lots of activity. So whether it is the impact of the most finally, after many years of work on this from Prince George's County, in November of 2021, they passed the countywide sectional map amendment. So, they had passed the zoning, the text, but it wasn't until the map was passed that it's fully in place. So what is that impact going to be on the construction of affordable housing? I think there is a lot of good things in the sectional map amendment that promotes housing around transit, which is great. And then not too far away in Montgomery County, they are also undergoing their own discussions through the Thrive 2050, their comprehensive planning effort, which is a major rewrite. And I think some say that it's even the largest rewrite in 30 plus years. And so there's lots of discussion. I would say I characterize this as a firestorm. And things like increasing density within 1 mile of the metro and more housing types, and trying to designate additional growth corridors. This has been very controversial. A lot of people just want to go with the status quo. And this discussion, I think, started to get really hot last summer. There have been some delays, and I would expect that there are going to be additional discussions into the fall. So this is something else that is worth watching. Similarly, Arlington County is having lots of discussion around the quote unquote missing middle housing types. So, and what is that missing middle? Basically in single family neighborhoods, how about allowing duplexes, or allowing, quads, 4-unit, small unit buildings. These can be designed in many great in ways that still make it look like or fit into a single family neighborhood. And so Arlington is taking a slow approach. They're now in phase 2 of their discussion on this. And they have some general design that they have come up with, but I think they want to explore some more design alternatives that are more detailed for the Arlington County context. And then Loudoun County is also undergoing a comprehensive rewrite of their zoning. And right now they're in the middle of public engagement, which started this month and will continue for the next several months. And then the city of Alexandria has also been is having a lot of discussion on how to create more affordability and how they change their bonus heights. So allowing more height in new zones in exchange for affordable housing. This is currently under discussion as well. So you see here lots of activity in the region. I'm going to stop right there to share and stop and see if we have some good discussion. And I would welcome whether you're a developer or you work for a local jurisdiction and you work in one of those local jurisdictions that I mentioned, if you would like to talk about what the impact that you've seen or just maybe some of the experiences from the discussion in that in the land use and zoning, I would definitely welcome that. Anybody from any of the jurisdictions, or Kay, is there anything too? I know that Jesse has mentioned some of the larger developments in the area in the past. I haven't talked to him as of late, and I'm just curious if there has been any movement within the city of Bowie regarding moderately priced dwelling units or some new developments taking place, some negotiations in that area with developers.
And well, I can give you two right away. One is, yes, we're working with the Melford development activity where they're going to build approximately 2,000 new units. We have a commitment of them for 5% of those units, or the rental units anyway, and that we can incorporate into our workforce, our affordable housing workforce housing program. So they have just gotten some of the permits approved for the senior housing as well as some apartments. So we're starting those negotiation discussions now, and I have to put that program together. Thank you for putting me on the spot to let me know that I'm a little behind. Second, let me just move to the next one to tell you, while you were doing this meeting, I was on a call with the Deputy CAO of Prince George's County of Economic Development and the Housing Director of Spacia with our Planning Director, Joe Minor, where our council has asked for 10% of the units to be built at the Mill Branch Crossing project across 301 there, not far from City Hall. That has moved now to the county. And today we were having some discussions and negotiations with the county while you were in this session, which is why I had to leave and come back, about how that would work in terms of the county providing us with some resources. So right now we're negotiating with them as we speak about the introduction of a pilot as well as use of their housing investment trust fund, which we just helped to funded $10 million here a few months ago as a result of the county's housing opportunities for all work group. So as we speak, those are two projects that we're working on right now to provide some affordable units within the city.
That's great. Those are great examples. So there really is a lot of activity happening in this region around land use and zoning. So it'll be curious to see how the region is able to coalesce around some of these issues and how we synchronize some of our practices. Probably this will be, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. I'm sure it's going to take several years likely for more of that. So in the interim is trying to figure out too, it's like, well, what can we agree on as a region that we want to work on together? So I think that'll be interesting to see. So so we'll certainly be monitoring that. I did want to put, I had seen that Roldan Ned was on here. I don't see her any longer. I was going to put her on the spot on this discussion around missing middle housing, because I see that is certainly something that has been discussed in at least 2 jurisdictions, if not more. I live in Montgomery County, but right close to the border with the district. I can basically walk over to the district and see lots of examples of duplexes that are worth a whole lot of money when they are appraised compared to the single family units on the other side. And yet on the Montgomery County side, there has been a sort of a lot of controversy, renting of garments. And I want to say, but hey, but there are examples like right there that are doing just fine, and it looks like just one home. So it's all about the design. So I know that's something that Arlington is looking at very closely, about making sure the design fits into the neighborhood. So that's one area. So I'm also curious to see if there are any comments too on some of the regional recommendations that we made. And if anyone here in the webinar has one particular recommendation that came to mind, that popped out as something that they said, oh yeah, this is something that we need to follow up and spend some more time on, or something that was missing, because we're certainly looking for comments from across the entire region for sure.
And as always, if you don't want to type in the chat, feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you.
And if you want to think about it, I'm also going to put somebody else on the spot. I see Marvin Turner is here. Is that our friend Marvin Turner from HUD? Is he here on the call? Welcome. We're glad that you're here.
So I have.
Oh, hello, Marvin. You can go ahead and come off mute. There you go. Looks like he's having trouble. There you go. You're unmuted now.
I am on the line. I was doing what everybody else does. I was double working.
Well, we're glad you're here, and I wanted to say hello, and just kind of wondered too. I was looking to see, I didn't see anything, but is there any update on the proposed changes to the affirmatively fair housing rule? Is there any movement, or are we still waiting for the department to publish its rule? Is it coming soon?
So you're asking some things that probably are headquarters-based questions, but what I would say is that this secretary and this leadership team here is very much in line with the discussion today. As you are aware, the secretary and her team also worked in what was called something that was not as much talked about today, but I'm sure I might have missed it. The issue with not just affirmative furthering for housing, but also the issue with disparities of appraisals.
Yes.
Gave opportunity, Melody Taylor, who's our regional fair housing director, served as the executive director. Jenny Way was involved. Freddie, FHFA was involved, which is sort of a sister organization that oversees Freddie and Fatty. But what I will say is this: I will never get ahead of the secretary in making an announcement if you're not getting any news out of me today.
But it's in the works, I understand. So
we stand pretty much all in on making certain that there's fairness, not just in housing, but in other opportunities that are around. So I appreciate the opportunity to say some words.
great. Well, good to hear from you, Marvin. So always a pleasure.
Pleasure's mine.
Glad to hear. Yeah. So so just to reiterate, we did mention it very briefly. I didn't spend a lot of time today on it, but I did mention it in different parts of the presentation on the issue with appraisals, and that's certainly a priority. And as Marvin mentioned, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which has oversight over the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they jointly work with HUD on this issue related to appraisals, and they're making it a priority to try to see how we can do a better job across the nation in making sure that there's more parity in the appraisals that take place. We have a similar home in one neighborhood to another, and same style, but yet you get different appraisals. And I think a couple of years ago there was a notorious incident that got a lot of public attention, and I think it was a couple that did basically their own informal version of testing, and they basically had their friends who were white. It was African American family, and they got their appraisal, and then they had their close friends who were a white family act like the homeowners and get the appraisal again, and they got two different prices. So this is why this has gotten so much attention, because we've seen this happen over and over again in that Washington Post, which is a fairly good and lengthy article that talks about the disparity. So we're very glad the secretary has made this a priority. I would say, going back to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which I wasn't involved in some of the comments from years ago, that I know the department is very sensitive to, that I know that they want to make sure that the obligation is met in the best way possible, with a lot of guidelines, so that jurisdictions know like what has to be included, how much work they have to do, but what are the resources available that the department can provide, so that it's not also so overly burdensome that it takes a lot of outside experts to conduct it, and be something that's very difficult to do. So I know that there's a lot of thought that's being given to that. So yeah. So as far as going back to the regional recommendations, as I mentioned to you, those are draft recommendations. So stay tuned, and you should also stay tuned to other community engagement that we are conducting. We have gone through primarily a lot of what I like to call the familiarization tour, which is just talking to different groups, agencies, commissions, that the regional fair housing plan was happening. We did some regional events with Challenging Racism, which brought together residents and groups from across the region in 3 various sessions last July, which was a great way just to talk about fair housing, but also the impact of discriminatory practices across the region. It was a very active discussion. And then we had this fall, we had several focus groups, and we had for each jurisdiction. So each jurisdiction had a focus groups with smaller organizations, nonprofits, commissions, and then a larger a public meeting that was open to the general public. We had a survey that had almost 4,000 respondents, which we're pleased with. And then we've tried to also stay in touch using social media, and whether it's COG social media, but also the jurisdictions social media and connecting with that. So the next phase that we're moving to is where the team is currently working on writing the draft, and then having that available for public comment. I think what we're looking at is sometime at the end of the month of May, where that is be available. So whether you live in whether you live in another jurisdiction is participating, whether it's the district or Alexandria or Fairfax or wherever you live, it'll be posted on the local jurisdiction's website, but it's also going to be posted in the COG website. And because it is regional, certainly residents from Prince George's County and the city of Bowie can weigh in on, especially on those regional goals as well. So I think we want to hear from residents, even if they're the jurisdictions themselves, Prince George's County, city of Bowie, are not participating formally. It is for the entire region. So comments are certainly welcome, particularly if again, you might live in Prince George's County or the city, but you live in the city of Alexandria or someplace else, and some of the other jurisdictions. So here is the website. We've tried to make it pretty easy. So it's mwcog.org/fair housing. We monitor the comments on there. We're trying to stay engaged with the social media using the hashtags Fair Housing DMV and the Housing Equity DMV. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be on the lookout for written comments, by email or by letter. And then in the summertime, there's going to be additional opportunities for formal public hearings before each of the county councils, as well as public meetings as well. So with that, I thank you for your time today, and I'm just going to open it up for any additional questions and comments. And see, I don't know, see if we can see our participants here. I think it's harder to do when you're in webinar mode.
Yeah.
I think that the pop-up looks a little bit different, but please come off on, you're welcome to come off mute and share any final feedback that you have for us or any questions. And if not, raise your hand. And if not, I will turn it over to Kay and Jesse for some final thoughts.
So as we wait to see if folks have questions, you can raise your hand or type in the chat. I want to mention again, all of the links that were being shared earlier, I have collected them all in a handout and I will email that to everyone who attended today. So you'll have that as a reference. And I'll also include a link to the City of Bowie Fair Housing Resource page, which has additional information about the differences between the county regulations on fair housing, the state regulations and the federal regulations, and links to other organizations and groups and handouts from a variety of perspectives, whether you're an employee of a county or municipal government, or if you're a realtor or a developer or a property manager or landlord, we have information for all of those different stakeholders on that website.
Let me just say in closing also that we thank you all for attending. We obviously thank Manuel for his stellar presentation and all the useful information he provided, but we also just want to point out again that fair housing issues and discrimination issues are real. And as a result, the information provided to you is not just for you to put away in your, put this PowerPoint away and forget about it, but remember that people are being discriminated against every hour of every day in every category that Manuel mentioned. So we need you in your respective roles and positions to be vigilant and adamant about your pursuit of justice and fair play for everyone. So we thank you again for attending today, and we hope that you all have a great rest of your week. And as Kay said, we'll provide you with all the additional information that you heard today, as well as the links. So thank you very much, and have a great day. Thank you again, Manuel.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Seeing no comments, I'm going to close the webinar down. We have a few thank yous in the chat for the presentation. Again, we appreciate everyone who attended, and keep an eye out for our resource email that will go out a little later today, or possibly tomorrow. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.